Hello everyone, it's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Just a year ago, on October 29, 2022, a horrific crowd crush in a narrow alley just a few meters away from Itaewon Station claimed the lives of 159 people. It was traumatizing for all, as it was the deadliest disaster in Korea since the sinking of the Sewol ferry in 2014. In just 2 days, 1 year will have passed, but there are still unresolved issues and ongoing debates on a variety of issues related to the tragedy. How are survivors, witnesses, and bereaved families holding up, and what are their requests? Furthermore, has an extensive safety system been set up since the crowd crush? For more on this, we have invited Professor Cho Hee-kyung from Hongik University. Welcome, Professor Cho.
Hello.
Hello, thank you for joining us. And we also have Professor David Oliver Kasdan as well from the Graduate School of Governance at Sungkyunkwan University. Good to see you, Professor Kasdan.
Good evening, thank you.
Good evening. Now, first question to our Professor Kasdan. So it's already been a year since the Itaewon tragedy. In your view, what scars did this disaster leave behind on Korean society?
I think in terms of the scarring or the trauma that's lasting, there's a lot of distrust still about the capacities of the emergency and disaster management in Korea. There's also, of course, the personal trauma that people are experiencing. There's maybe, a little bit of worry that there's not enough transparency about how to investigate this, as well as what to do going forward to try and avoid any future situations that might be similar. So on a more everyday level, people are probably a little bit worried and wary of being in large crowds and confined spaces, which honestly is a good sort of instinct to develop, especially in Seoul, which is highly packed with people. It's a dense area, so people need to be thinking about their own safety, and as well as looking for exits. In any situation, know what your exits are and what kinds of threats might be there. So the scarring, is certainly a bad thing, but we can hopefully learn and be a little more wary and aware of our situations going forward.
All right, I cannot agree more, Professor Kasdan. Well, Professor Cho, almost everyone in the country was, of course, shocked by the tragedy on October 29th last year. However, the most affected would be survivors, bereaved families, and witnesses of the disaster, along with merchants in that area. Could you tell us more about the trauma people suffered from this incident and how the area has also been hit?
As you mentioned, I certainly believe that those who are most directly affected are the victims' families and survivors and their families. I believe many of the survivors still suffer from what's known as survivor's guilt, especially those who lost their close friends or loved ones on the same night. The families also suffer as a result, and not just emotionally and mentally. Most of those who died are young people and also people in their 40s. I think the oldest victim was somebody in his 50s. And so many of them were also contributors financially to their family's income. And so the families also are experiencing some financial hardship as a result. And there hasn't yet been proper compensation scheme that's put into effect. One group that we don't really talk about are the rescuers, the frontline police officers and firefighters and other emergency operators and workers who are actually on the scene trying to rescue people and dealing with the crushed bodies. And they are also suffering from PTSD to an extreme degree. Certainly the commercial trade in the area is almost decimated. I recently visited Itaewon and there are more shops that are closed, more empty premises than trading ones along the main drag in Itaewon. And it's even worse than what it used to be during the COVID shutdown. So I think it's going to take a very long time for the area to recover.
Right, right. I mean, the fact the National Center for Disaster and Trauma conducted over 7,100 counseling sessions over the past year itself, I think, shows how much people had to be affected psychologically. Well, hope who needs psychological assistance gets it so that no one has to feel isolated nor powerless. Well, Professor Kasdan, before we talk about unresolved issues we need to tackle, I'd like to refer to the article you wrote about this tragedy. You pointed out that while it was horrifying, it was not wholly surprising, as Korea is particularly susceptible to the biases of the bystander effect, hurting, and convenience. What is this all about?
So in social psychology or behavioral economics, there are some biases that people display, and it can be cultural or social biases, things brought about from their environment. And Korea, being a collectivist, Neo-Confucian culture, there's a few of these biases that are more normalized in here, one of them being herd behavior or social norms, which is a tendency to do what everybody else is doing because that way you'll be fitting in, and it kind of ties back to the Confucian value of harmony. And then there's the bystander effect, which is a hesitation to step forward and do something when there's a problem because you're unsure of your own authority or capacities to help. And then convenience, which is highly prized in Korea. It can be seen by, expecting there to be buses and taxis all the time, or stores open when you need them. And so putting these three sort of major effects together in a densely populated urban environment invites possible problems. And most notably, they could feed into a crowd issue, or in this case, a crush or stampede. So that's why I said it wasn't wholly surprising. It seems there are some elements in behavior from Korean society that, given a situation like Itaewon last year, bad things could happen.
Right, I see your point of view. I think it is something that we really need to think about, Professor Kasdan. Thank you. Now, Professor Cho, now to some of the issues that need to be further resolved. Though it has already been 1 year, many say no one has been held responsible for punished despite it being a man-made tragedy. I would like to know who is currently indicted on charges related to this disaster. Could you tell us about it?
You're right. There was an attempt to hold, at least politically responsible, the minister in charge of public safety, the Minister for Administration and Public Safety, Lee Sang-min, but that failed. The Constitutional Court refused to recognize that this was an impeachable offense. There are currently 5 ongoing trials regarding some 22 or so people who are involved in this disaster, including the chief of Yongsan District Council, the chief of Yongsan Police Station, and the chief of Yongsan Fire Station. But most of those who have been who are indicted by the prosecution are essentially frontline people who are being faulted for their response to the disaster on the night, whereas the very nature of this kind of crush disaster, you really don't have much that you can do afterwards, post the event. What is really crucial is the preparation and planning beforehand, how to manage crowd control, how to direct foot traffic and motor vehicle traffic to make the area more safe. And for example, the chief of Seoul Metropolitan Police has not been indicted, even though he is on the record numerous times attending meetings with senior police officers, telling them himself to make sure to plan and prepare carefully for the Halloween in Itaewon that year, because it was going to be the first time that, after COVID restrictions have been lifted, people were able to gather without masks. So the police actually transferred the cases across to the prosecution with the recommendation for the Met police chief to be indicted, and that hasn't happened. So there is big question as to why are these people who are directly responsible for maintaining public safety in these circumstances not being indicted. And in addition to that, I just like to point out one thing. With respect to Professor Kasdan, the way he sort of describes and refers to the crowd and the herd mentality and the bystander bias, those kind of things, I think have the risk or tend to sound as if you are victim blaming. And in this case, the victims could not be blamed. It's not their behavior that led to their deaths. It's the lack of forward planning and the lack of mobile police units who should have been there to control and manage the crowd. And that wasn't done. We had many more people in the area in the previous years before COVID. So since 2014, there were easily upwards of 100,000 people gathered in Itaewon to celebrate Halloween. By the same logic, we should have had this kind of incident much earlier, but it didn't. The big difference in 2022 compared to other years was that there was not enough police presence on the ground to direct traffic, including foot traffic. And we cannot, look over that.
Right. Thank you for sharing your point of view, Professor Cho. And that being said, bereaved families want a special law mandating an independent council investigation to pass at the National Assembly. How necessary is such a law in your opinion? And if it does get passed, what change could we expect?
Yes, in fact, that issue actually came up at the United Nations Human Rights Committee when they held a periodic review of the human rights situation in South Korea just last week. One of the experts of the Human Rights Committee pointedly asked our government why this special law regarding Itaewon disaster has not been passed. And I mentioned that the police has carried out an investigation and there are currently criminal trials ongoing. But what is really necessary is an independent inquiry or an independent commission or council, whatever form it might be, that has a wider remit to really investigate closely and properly and more openly what went wrong and why. A criminal investigation only looks at criminal responsibility, and those who are accused obviously have the right of self-defense, and they have the right to essentially not disclose information that could be detrimental to their defense. Now, what we should be doing right now is not really looking at blaming people, that can come later, but finding out exactly what happened and why things went so disastrously wrong. When in previous years, as I said, more people had gathered and this kind of disaster didn't occur. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Plus, the independent inquiry could also represent the victims and their families better. And that's what's really needed for some kind of closure for those who are still suffering.
Right, I cannot agree more. So Professor Cho pointed out the reason why independent council investigation could be more effective in delving and looking into the matter more seriously. Now, Professor Cho, one more question. I remember that the reason it was hard to specifically hold people accountable for this tragedy was because in Korea, there's no legal basis to assign responsibility for safety during a large gathering that doesn't have any specific host. Has this law been amended yet?
That was a complete red herring and a flimsy excuse and rule that some of the senior public servants tried to use to cover up, really. I think it was initially the Yongsan district council chief who said, oh, this was not an organized event, and so we didn't have any responsibility to, provide public safety measures. That's absolutely nonsense. First of all, there is a constitutional right and duty on the state to ensure that the people are kept safe and protected from dangers in these kind of situations. Now, you can say, well, that's just the Constitution. You don't really have any rights unless you have specific laws. And we do have specific laws. They use this disaster and safety management law saying that, well, if there is an organized event and an organizer, you have to submit a plan about public safety beforehand and get that approved. And because the Itaewon event, the Halloween event, was not an organized one, there was no duty. But under the same law, there is a very clear duty on the district authorities or the local authorities to ensure public safety when there is an expectation of large crowd gathering or similar situations. There's also the law regarding the powers and duties of police officers, which clearly mandate the police to ensure that in chaotic or crowded situations, they need to act and they must act to prevent risks and dangers and to protect public safety. And so to say that, well, people can't be held responsible because there was no organizer or this was not an organized event, that's absolutely nonsense. And the current criminal trials that are ongoing about the very dereliction and criminal negligence on the part of those high-level officers.
All right, I understand your point, Professor Cho. Let's take a look at another aspect that needs some improvement. I remember there was some criticism that illegal construction by the Hamilton Hotel was one of the reasons for the tragedy. However, apparently there's still a lot of illegal construction around the Yongsan-gu district. Professor Cho, what legal grounds do we need to effectively deal with this illegal construction issue?
I believe that building regulations and codes have become much more strict than in the past. But what's still lacking is that it's possible to get away with having built an illegal construction and simply paying a fine. So forcible demolition of such illegal construction should be able to be made by the local authority. So the local authorities should be given that kind of power. And also better enforcement. We already have necessary laws in place. But there is still too much, I dare say, corruption in the construction industry and people looking the other way. Even the Yongsan District Council chief has had an illegal construction added to her house that she owns in Yongsan, and that was overlooked for many years. That came out as a result of the Itaewon tragedy. And so those kind of things should not be condoned.
All right, I see. Well, Professor Kasdan, we have been talking about the issues that we need to tackle, but in my opinion, what matters is coming up with measures. So let's take a look at how we need to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. After the tragedy, the government drew up a comprehensive plan for rebuilding the safety system, including ways to use some high tech. Could you tell us what the plans were?
As far as I know, the only plan that's been reported I've seen is that there has been an establishment of some surveillance centers around various GUs in Seoul. And specifics were they would be manned 24/7, 2 people per shift, and there would essentially be a room with a bank of TV monitors where they could be alerted through some of the technologies, including AI and facial recognition, if there were crowds or threats. And then the personnel working at these security monitoring centers would have direct lines to fire or police to notify them if there's a concern. The problem, I think, with this setup is I'm not sure that these security centers are vested with any authority to call into action. So essentially, they've set up an extra set of eyes and ears, but it still needs to get to a person in power who's going to make decisions. And what appears to have happened with last year's tragedy is that getting to the person in power in a timely manner was difficult, and then the person in power wasn't making decisions fast enough until they got to the scene, which, fighting through crowds that evening, took way too long.
Right, so there are still some of the parts that we need to deal with. Now, Professor Cho, I believe raising public awareness over safety is another important pillar of this matter. And so, according to the data from the National Fire Agency, the total number of rescues due to accidents from January to September this year rose above 510,000, and it's expected to surpass last year's level at the current rate. Based on this, many say we need to overcome this safety frigidity. What's your view on this, and how should it be dealt with?
You know, they talk about statistics. I mean, lies and lies and statistics. I'm not saying the figures are wrong, but without knowing more about the nature of the kind of rescues that were performed by the authority, I can't really comment on what kind of awareness raising we need to do, because, for example, you know, we are now companion animal owning nation. More than 1/3 of the population has a cat or a dog, and the increased number could be, I don't know, rescuing a cat rather than, you know, more people in danger or something. Also, some of the increase might be due to, for example, climate change and sudden changes in weather patterns and etc. So I find it a little bit difficult to sort of to know how to approach the particular number. But I would say that in general, you know, paradoxically, as science advances, we become more uncertain about things because we know much more about what we don't know, and we have much more critical thinking or faculty about who are the experts, because there is no a general agreement and not one perhaps single answer to everything. So that, I think, leads to, you know, an increased sense of vulnerability and uncertainty. A little bit like how sociologists Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens have pointed out, we now live in a risk society. Thanks to technological advances, we actually feel we are more unsafe. And what's the answer? Well, I think one answer is to understand where those vulnerabilities are, and possibly even, you know, more kind of customized basic training. For example, we now provide our primary school children with basic swimming skills. We should also provide them with, you know, public safety skills, how to conduct yourself in very crowded, you know, areas, etc. And so those are the kind of things that we could be thinking about as a society.
All right, I cannot agree more, Professor Cho. Well, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to our Professor Kasdan. So overall, how should we remember this tragedy, and what should be the priority to prevent this from happening again? I mean, what are the measures we need to take?
Well, I think we need to remember that disaster and emergency management is a cycle. And so as we're in the recovery phase now, we need to continue and transition to mitigation, which means reducing risk going forward. And things like installing surveillance systems and improving communication lines are good in the technical sense, but there needs to be some effort to get people to participate and understand their situation and their context. You know, my analysis where I see various biases and behaviors isn't victim blaming at all. It's just a description of context, the same way that we could describe the alley in Itaewon as being too narrow and steep. And so I think we need to be more aware of our situations and raise people's level of consciousness about what's around them and what threats might exist. If you remember anything from this tragedy, it should be that people need to be aware of their surroundings and look for safe routes and exits, and also have a little preparation. As Professor Cho mentioned, learning what to do in case of an emergency, a fire, or CPR, doing proper CPR. These kinds of things can be shared. And so this is what I mean by increasing participation, is that safety for Korean society, because it's so dense and there's so many people in this space, safety needs to be a shared concern and a shared responsibility.
All right, I agree, Professor Kasdan, and thank you for your advice. Well,
Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Kasdan and Professor Cho, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be next Monday with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the weekend, and goodbye.